The First National Bank of Rattlesnake Creek was an oven thick with the smell of stale sweat and palpable fear. Thomas Redmond stood against the far wall, motionless a ghost in the swirling dust motes, illuminated by the harsh afternoon sun slanting through the tall windows. He was not like the others. The whimpering teller, the frozen-faced rancher, the woman clutching her purse as if it were a child. Their terror was a frantic buzzing thing. His was a cold, patient weight in the pit of his stomach. He was an observer, a student of this violent ballet. 3 men worked the room. 2 were clumsy brutes, their movements jerky and loud, shoving sacks at the teller and waving their pistols with nervous bravado. But the leader was different. He moved with a chilling economy of motion, his eyes the color of a winter sky, missing nothing. He was a predator, serene in his element. While his men terrorized the staff, he calmly directed the affair, his voice a low murmur that cut through the panicked silence more effectively than a shout. 30 seconds. The leader set his gaze flicking across the room before settling on a large, ornate silver pocket watch he drew from his vest. He clicked it open. Thomas froze. The world narrowed to the glint of sun on polished silver, the intricate filigree of vines and leaves etched into the casing. He knew that watch. He knew the small looping initials, ER, half hidden in the swirling design. Eleanor Redmond. His sister. The blood drained from his face, replaced by an icy fury that had been his only companion for 3 long years. The watch had been a gift from their father, her most prized possession. It had vanished the day she died, along with her husband Silas Kane, a man of charming smiles and a cruelty as deep and cold as a winter well. Thomas had tracked Silas for a year, following a trail of broken men and whispered rumors, until he'd heard Silas had been killed in a saloon brawl in a nameless Texas border town. Thomas had believed it. He had wanted to believe it. But here was Silas alive, breathing the same air, holding Eleanor's watch as he timed the robbery of a backwater bank. This wasn't a random stick-up. For Thomas, it was a ghost, walking out of a shallow grave, a hunt he thought long over, now roaring back to life. His presence in Rattlesnake Creek was no accident. He had followed a whisper, a rumor of a land-grabbing phantom who used debt as a weapon. He'd never imagined it would be him. Time. Silas said, snapping the watch shut. The sound echoed in the silent room like a gunshot. His men grabbed the sacks of money, backing toward the door. Silas's cold eyes swept the room one last time, a final contemptuous dismissal of the herd he had just culled. His gaze passed over Thomas, without a flicker of recognition. To Silas, he was just another face in the crowd, another faceless victim. The robbers burst through the doors and into the blinding sunlight. Hoofbeats thundered, a cloud of red dust billowed, and then they were gone. The spell broke. The woman sobbed, the teller collapsed against the counter, and the rancher let out a ragged breath. Thomas remained perfectly still. The image of the watch burned into his mind. He was not a drifter caught in a bad situation. He was a man with a purpose, and that purpose had just been given a name and a face once more. The hunt was on. The afternoon sun baked the adobe walls of Rattlesnake Creek until they shimmered, and a fine red dust settled like a shroud over everything, the sagging porch roofs and the thirsty horses at the trough, the very soul of the town itself. It was a place teetering on the edge of oblivion, a temporary stop for men on their way to somewhere better or somewhere worse. After the robbery, the town buzzed with a nervous energy that settled by dusk into a familiar, weary rhythm. The sheriff, a man whose ambition had long ago been eroded by heat and apathy, took a few half-hearted notes and declared the robbers long gone. For Thomas, this was a blessing. He wanted no lawmen muddying the waters of his private war. His first step was to melt back into the landscape to become invisible again. A large cattle drive, the /R outfit, was camped just outside of town gathering supplies before pushing north. It was the perfect cover. A trail hand was just another worn face in a sea of them, a man whose past was his own business. The trail boss, a leathery old hand named McCoy, hired him on the spot, needing a man who could handle himself to ride flank on the long push to the territory's northern grasslands. While Thomas secured his place among the cowboys, Florence Pierce was trapped in a different kind of hell. Her world was the small, stifling adobe house she shared with her Uncle Raymond. It smelled of stale whiskey and simmering resentment. 3 years she'd been his ward, ever since cholera had stolen her parents and left her adrift. At first, he had been merely neglectful, but as his gambling debts mounted and the whiskey took a firmer hold, his neglect curdled into a casual biting cruelty. That evening, the cruelty was sharper than usual. She had accidentally burned the cornbread, a minor sin that Raymond treated as a personal betrayal. Useless, he snarled, shoving the blackened bread to the floor. Just like your mother, all airs and no substance. He staggered to a small wooden chest in the corner, her mother's chest, and fumbled it open. He pulled out a delicate silver locket, her mother's favorite. This ought to fetch a few dollars. At least one of you is good for something. No, Florence cried, lunging for it. Please, Uncle. That's all I have left of her. He backhanded her a swift, practiced motion that sent her stumbling. You have a roof over your head, girl. A roof I pay for. Don't you forget it. He pocketed the locket and stormed out, slamming the door behind him. Florence sank to the floor, the sting on her cheek a dull ache compared to the sharp pain in her heart. He was in debt, she knew that much. Deeply in debt to a powerful unseen figure who had recently come into the territory, a man whose name was only whispered. A man who, according to town gossip, did not suffer fools or defaulters lightly. She pressed her fingers to her cheek, a single hot tear tracing a path through the grime. She was trapped a bird in a cage, and the door was shrinking with every bottle her uncle emptied. The saloon was a symphony of chaos, a tinny piano battling with loud boasts, the clink of glasses, and the thick, cloying smell of sweat and cheap liquor. Raymond Pierce, flush with the whiskey purchased from the sale of his dead sister's locket, held court at a corner table. He wasn't just drinking, he was negotiating. Across from him sat 2 hard-faced men, the same 2 brutes from the bank robbery, their eyes flat and predatory. Florence stood beside her uncle, a prisoner summoned for inspection, her wrist trapped in his sweaty iron grip. Pretty little thing, ain't she? Raymond slurred his words, a foul vapor in the air. Good worker, too. Cooks, cleans, does it all. My debt to Mr. Kane will be settled, and he gets himself a fine new housekeeper for his homestead. The word housekeeper hung in the air, a chilling euphemism that made Florence's blood run cold. She had heard the whispers about Silas Kane, the man who was buying up the territory one desperate rancher at a time. They said he was as ruthless as a starving wolf. I am not property, Uncle. Florence said, her voice low but sharp, a sliver of steel beneath the fear. Raymond laughed, a wet, ugly sound. You're what I say you are. He tightened his grip. A man's got debts, girl. What would you know about it? The chairs scraped against the floorboards with a sound that cut through the saloon's din. Thomas Redmond rose from the shadows, a tall, silent figure moving into the lamplight. His face was unreadable, his eyes fixed on the scene with an unnerving intensity. Not while I live, he said. The words were quiet, not a shout, but they carried the weight of a granite stone dropped into a still pond. Every head turned. One of Silas's men sneered, Who the hell are you? The name's Thomas Redmond. He said, his gaze locked on Raymond. And selling your own flesh and blood to settle a debt with a man like Silas Kane isn't business. It's an abomination. The mention of Cain's name sent a fresh ripple through the room. It confirmed the whispers. It gave the monster a name. Florence stared at this stranger, this Thomas Redmond. He knew Cain. There was a history there etched in the hard lines around his mouth. "This is family business, Cowboy." Raymond blustered, trying to regain his footing. "Mind your own. I'm making it my affair." Thomas set his hand resting casually near the worn grip of his Colt. He looked at Florence, a flicker of something pity recognition in his storm-gray eyes. "The lady seems to disagree with the terms of the sale." "She ain't got a say." Raymond bellowed, his courage fueled by whiskey. "She has every say." Thomas countered, his voice dropping to a low, cold promise. "Let her go. Now." He saw it then. He saw the same trapped look in Florence's eyes that he remembered in Eleanor's. He saw a bully preying on the helpless, all in service to Silas Cain. He could not stand by. Not again. He had failed his sister. He would not fail this stranger. The tension stretched taut. Raymond, for all his bluster, was a coward. He saw the unwavering certainty in Thomas's eyes and the coiled readiness in his stance. He saw a man who had made a decision, and it was a decision that would not end well for him. With a curse, Raymond flung Florence's wrist away from him. "She ain't worth the trouble." He spat on the floor and staggered toward the bar. Silas's men exchanged a look. Their orders were to collect a girl, not to get into a gunfight with a stranger who looked like he knew how to use the iron he carried. With a shrug, they melted back into the crowd. The moment the danger passed, Florence felt her strength waver. Thomas was beside her in an instant. "Are you all right, Miss?" "Florence Pierce." She managed, rubbing the angry red marks on her wrist. "Thank you." "No thanks needed." He said, his voice softer now. "But you can't go back with him." "I have nowhere else to go." She admitted the shame of her situation burning in her cheeks. Thomas thought for a moment. "I'm with the /R cattle drive. We need a cook. Our last one was more familiar with a bottle than a skillet. It's hard work, but it's honest pay. And it'll get you out of this town, out of his reach." It was a lifeline, a desperate, unexpected chance. She looked into his steady eyes and saw not a predator, but a protector. An enigma, certainly, but a safe one. "I accept," she said, her voice clear and firm. "I accept Mr. Redmond." He gave a slight, almost imperceptible nod. "We leave at dawn. I'll see you're not bothered until then." As he escorted her to the town's only boarding house, Florence knew her life had irrevocably fractured. The world she knew was gone, and the path ahead was a dark, unknown trail, with this quiet, dangerous man as her only guide. The trail was a hard master, demanding and unforgiving. Florence quickly learned that cooking for a dozen hungry cowboys from the back of a bouncing chuck wagon was a world away from the relative quiet of her uncle's kitchen. But the work was honest, and for the first time in years, she felt the simple dignity of earning her own keep. The cowboys, rough-hewn and weathered, treated her with a gruff respect, a courtesy enforced by Thomas Redmond's silent, watchful presence. He offered her the job to get her out of town, a simple act of rescue. But Silas Cain's influence, she was learning, stretched long and thin like a spider's web across the territory. 3 days out from Rattlesnake Creek, as the drive navigated a narrow, winding canyon at dusk, the web tightened. The light was failing, painting the towering rock walls in shades of blood orange and deep purple. Long shadows writhed like serpents across the canyon floor. Florence was guiding the chuck wagon mules with Pete, the grizzled old cowboy she'd replaced, riding alongside. Thomas and the others were further ahead with the herd. A rifle shot cracked the evening stillness, the sound echoing sharp and deadly off the stone. A bullet splintered the wagon seat an inch from Florence's head. The mules screamed and bolted. "Ambush," Pete roared, drawing his pistol. Two riders burst from a rocky outcrop, the same two men from the saloon. They weren't trying to rob the drive. Their eyes were fixed on the wagon, on her. They were here to reclaim Silas Kane's property. The wagon careened wildly, threatening to splinter against the canyon walls. Florence fought the reins, her arms screaming with the strain, trying to keep the panicked mules from running them off the narrow track. Pete fired back his shots wide in the jostling chaos. One of the ambushers took aim at him, a clean shot. Suddenly, a third rider appeared, as if from the very rock, thundering down a steep scree slope. It was Thomas. He rode with a reckless grace, his horse sure-footed even on the treacherous terrain. His revolver was in his hand, and he fired twice, not with the wild panic of the others, but with a calm, deadly precision. One of the ambushers cried out and clutched his shoulder, his horse shying away. "Ah, Florence, the cutoff." Thomas yelled, his voice cutting through the din. "To your left, there's a game trail." She saw it, a barely perceptible break in the canyon wall, a path no wider than the wagon itself. It was a desperate gamble. One wrong move, and they would be dashed on the rocks below. The second rider was closing in, his pistol raised. "Do it," Thomas shouted. Trusting him. Florence hauled on the reins with all her might, guiding the terrified mules toward the narrow opening. The wagon wheels shrieked in protest, one lifting precariously off the ground. For a heart-stopping moment, she thought they were going to tip. She braced for the crash. Then, with a violent lurch, the wagon righted itself and plunged into the darker confines of the side passage. Behind them, she heard another shot from Thomas, followed by a curse, the sound of a retreating horse. The game trail was short, spitting them out onto the main path 100 yards ahead, behind a bend that shielded them from view. Florence wrestled the mules to a halt, her body trembling, her knuckles white on the reins. Pete was pale, checking a shallow graze on his arm. A moment later, Thomas appeared, his horse lathered in sweat. He dismounted, his face grim, his eyes scanning the canyon rim behind them. "They're gone, for now." He walked over to the wagon, his gaze finding Florence's. He saw her trembling hands, her wide, frightened eyes. "You did good," he said, his voice quiet. "You did real good." The shared danger, the frantic intensity of the chase, had forged something new between them. It was more than gratitude on her part, more than duty on his. It was a bond of trust, sealed by gunpowder and fear in the fading light of a desert canyon. As the rest of the cowhands rode back, alerted by the shots, Florence looked at Thomas Redmond, truly seeing him for the first time. He was not just a kind stranger. He was a man with dangerous skills and a past that was now inextricably tangled with her future. And for the first time, the thought did not frighten her. The cattle drive pushed north, a slow, moving river of hide and horn, flowing across an endless landscape of sagebrush and sky. The ambush in the canyon had changed things. The unspoken tension between Thomas and Florence had been replaced by a quiet, watchful partnership. The pretense of him being just another trail hand had evaporated. The other cowboys saw it too, affording him a new level of deference. He was a man with secrets, and Florence was now one of them. Their investigation became a silent, collaborative effort. At every dusty way station or fledgling town, they worked in tandem. Thomas would disappear for hours, seeking out the local sheriff or blacksmith men who dealt in facts and ironclad rumors. He'd return to camp late, his face grim, sharing little snippets of what he'd learned as Florence handed him a plate of food by the firelight. Man named Silas Kane owns the mortgage on nearly every ranch in this valley. He'd murmur his voice low enough for only her to hear. Drought hit hard last year. He was there with loans. Generous terms, they said. Until the first payment came due. Florence, in turn, became his eyes and ears in the places a man like him couldn't go. While buying flour and beans at a general store, she would linger listening to the worried gossip of the ranchers' wives. "The Miller place is gone," one woman whispered over a bolt of calico. "Just packed up and left in the middle of the night. Their well went dry, and Mr. Kane called in their note the very next day." Piece by piece, they assembled a grim mosaic. Silas Kane was not just a bank robber. He was a vulture circling the vulnerable, using misfortune and intimidation to amass a territorial empire. His goal wasn't just money. It was land power, the slow strangulation of entire communities. The investigative work drew them closer, but it was the small, unguarded moments in between that truly deepened their connection. One evening, as a cold wind whipped across the plains, Thomas found her huddled by the fire, her thin shawl offering little protection. Without a word, he returned from his bedroll with his own heavy wool blanket and draped it around her shoulders. He lingered for a moment, his hand resting gently on her shoulder, before retreating to the far side of the fire. Another time, tending to a gash on his arm from a stray horn, her fingers brushed against his. The brief contact sent a jolt through them both, an unspoken acknowledgement of the current that flowed just beneath the surface of their formal interactions. He still called her Miss Pierce, a barrier of propriety he seemed unwilling to cross, but the way he said it had changed. The name was now imbued with a soft, protective warmth. He started noticing the small things, the worn-out state of her boots, prompting a sturdy new pair to be anonymously added to the wagon's supply shipment at the next town. The way she bit her lip when she was worried. The quiet strength in her eyes that never wavered, no matter the hardship. They talked of the future, but only in veiled terms. "What will you do once the drive is over?" she asked one night, staring into the dancing flames. "There's a ranch up north," he answered, his voice distant. "The JT. The owner, James Thornton, is an old, honest man. He was a friend of my father's. He's always looking for good help." It was the first piece of his own history he had ever offered her. "It's good country. A person could make a life there." He didn't say we. He didn't say you. But as she pulled his blanket tighter around her shoulders, Florence heard the unspoken invitation in his words. The JT Ranch was no longer just a destination. It was a promise, a potential sanctuary at the end of a long, dangerous road. A place where their shared path might finally lead them out of the shadows. The JT Ranch was an oasis. After weeks on the dusty, unforgiving trail, the sight of its green pastures, the sturdy, well-kept buildings, and the clear running water of Cottonwood Creek felt like a paradise. James Thornton, the ranch's owner, was a man in his late 60s with a kind, weathered face and eyes that held a deep, abiding sadness. He greeted Thomas with the warm familiarity of an old family friend and welcomed Florence with a gentle courtesy that immediately put her at ease. He confirmed the offer of a job as the main house cook, promising her a safe home and fair wages. For the first time in her life, Florence felt the weight of fear begin to lift. Here, under the protection of a good man on land that felt solid and true, she could finally start to build a life. The sprawling ranch house was a sanctuary, its thick adobe walls a fortress against the outside world. She and Thomas believed they had outrun Silas Kane. They believed they had reached safety. They were wrong. That evening, after Florence had settled into her new quarters, Thornton summoned both her and Thomas to his study. The room was dark and heavy, filled with the scent of old leather and wood smoke. A single lamp cast long dancing shadows on the walls. Thornton sat behind his large oak desk, but he was not the benevolent patriarch they had met earlier. He was a broken man. His shoulders were slumped, his hands trembled, and the sadness in his eyes had deepened into raw despair. "I'm glad you're here, Thomas." He began, his voice a hoarse whisper. "But you've walked into a trap. This place, this ranch, is no longer my own." Thomas leaned forward. "James, what's happened?" Thornton's gaze drifted to a photograph on his desk, a young man with his father's kind eyes. "It's my son, Daniel." He looked up, his expression tortured. "Silas Kane has him." The name landed like a physical blow in the quiet room. Florence felt the air leave her lungs. The sanctuary had become a prison. "Kane came to me a month ago." Thornton continued, his voice cracking. "He didn't want to buy my land, not outright. He wants to own it, to control it completely. This ranch controls the only reliable water source in this entire region. With it, he can bleed every other homesteader dry. When I refused to sell, he took my boy." He explained the chilling arrangement. Kane was holding Daniel at an unknown location. Thornton was to maintain the appearance of normalcy, to continue running the ranch as if nothing were wrong. Any attempt to contact the law, any sign of resistance, and Daniel would pay the price. "He wants the deed." Thornton finished, his voice heavy with defeat. "Signed, sealed, and delivered. He's been bleeding me dry financially, using his network to block my cattle sales and call in loans I took out with the bank he now secretly controls. He's destroying me piece by piece, savoring it. He's waiting for me to be completely broken before he makes his final move." Thomas and Florence exchanged a look of dawning horror. They hadn't escaped Silas at all. They had followed his trail directly to its epicenter. They hadn't led Florence to a safe haven. They had brought her to the heart of the conflict, the prized jewel in Silas Kane's burgeoning, blood-soaked empire. The JT Ranch was not a refuge. It was the next battlefield. And they were standing squarely in the kill zone. The days at the JT Ranch became a tense, suffocating performance. To the ranch hands and the outside world, everything was normal. Florence cooked, Thornton gave orders, and Thomas acted the part of a newly hired hand, learning the lay of the land. But beneath the surface, a desperate, silent war was being waged. At night, the three of them would meet in Thornton's study, poring over maps, trying to guess where Kane might be holding Daniel, formulating plans that were always discarded as too risky. Hope was a dwindling commodity, Silas, it seemed, enjoyed his power. He let the situation simmer, tightening the screws, slowly deriving a sick pleasure from Thornton's agony. He needed a final piece of leverage, a way to shatter Thornton's last vestiges of defiance. He found it in Florence's own blood. One afternoon, a rider approached the ranch, a pathetic, stooped figure on a sway-backed horse. It was Raymond Pierce. Florence's heart seized in her chest. Thomas and Thornton intercepted him at the gate, their hands on their guns. But Raymond wasn't there to fight. He was a picture of contrived remorse, his eyes watery, his hands shaking. "I've made a terrible mistake, Florence." He pleaded, his voice thick with false sincerity. "That man Kane, he's a devil. He promised to clear my debts, but he's ruined me. I want to make it right." He claimed to have information. He said he'd overheard Silas's men talking about Daniel's location, an old abandoned line shack in the foothills, a place so remote no one would ever think to look. He offered to lead Florence there, under the pretense of a secret meeting to arrange a trade. "Kane trusts me," he whined. "He'll listen to me. I can get him to swap the boy for you. Just until the deed is signed. He wants leverage over Thomas, too. He knows about you two." It was a trap, and they all knew it. But the mention of Daniel's location, the slimmest chance it might be true, was a bait they couldn't ignore. While Thomas argued for a direct assault, Florence saw a different path. "No," she said, her voice firm. "Let me go. Let him think his plan is working. It's the only way to get close without them killing Daniel." "Absolutely not." Thomas set his face a mask of cold fury. "It's a trap, Florence," Thornton warned. "I know," she replied, her gaze meeting Thomas's. "But it's our only chance to turn it on them." Their planning was meticulous and desperate. Thomas and a few of Thornton's most loyal hands would follow at a distance, using Raymond's path to lead them to the real location of Cain's stronghold. It was a terrible risk predicated on a traitor's word. Raymond led Florence into the hills as dusk began to fall. He took her not to a lined shack, but to a small, crumbling mission chapel, its bell tower a skeletal finger pointing at a bruised sky. "In here," he said, his act of repentance wearing thin. The moment they stepped inside, the heavy doors slammed shut behind them. Silas Cain's men emerged from the shadows. The trap had been sprung. As they bound her hands, Raymond avoided her gaze, his face a miserable portrait of self-loathing and cowardice. "He promised me." He muttered more to himself than to her. "He promised he'd forgive my debts." Florence looked at her uncle, at the man who had sold her not once, but twice. And she felt nothing but a cold, empty pity. He was a ghost, haunted by his own weakness. Her own fear was a distant thing pushed aside by a cold, hard resolve. Back at the ranch, Thomas returned to the main house to find Florence gone as planned. But on the door to her empty room, a note was pinned with a knife, Silas's final arrogant move. The script was clean and precise. The deed for the girl. Sunrise at my homestead on Black Mesa. Come alone, Redmond, or she dies first, then the boy. The clock was ticking. The trap had been turned, the stakes raised to an impossible height. The final confrontation was no longer just about land or water rights. It was about redemption, revenge, and the lives of the two people Thomas Redmond cared about most in the world. Black Mesa rose from the plains like a jagged black tooth, its summit perpetually wreathed in the dark underbelly of an approaching storm. At its peak sat Silas Cain's stronghold, an old fortified homestead overlooking a sheer drop into a winding canyon. It was a fortress built by paranoia and malice. As Thomas Thornton and 3 of his most trusted men approached under the cover of the turbulent twilight, the sky rumbled with a low, ominous promise. Wind howled through the rocks, tearing at their clothes and whipping dust into their eyes. The storm was their only ally. There was one infiltration. They left the horses in a ravine a mile from the homestead and proceeded on foot, moving like wraiths through the gnarled juniper and creosote bushes. The wind was a roaring beast, muffling the sound of their cautious footsteps and the frantic beating of their own hearts. 2 guards were posted at the perimeter, huddled against the gale. Thomas took one a silent takedown with the butt of his pistol. Thornton's foreman, a grim man named Hank, took the other. They moved forward, the homestead looming larger, its windows glowing with a sinister warm light against the bruised purple of the sky. The first drops of rain, cold and heavy, began to fall. Phase 2. The confrontation. Leaving the others to secure the perimeter and watch for Silas's men, Thomas slipped through a side door they had unlocked. He moved through the quiet house, his pistol a cold, steady weight in his hand. He found them in the main room before a massive stone fireplace. Florence was bound to a heavy chair, her face pale, but her eyes blazing with defiance. A few feet away, a terrified young man, Daniel Thornton, was similarly tied. and standing between them, calmly polishing Eleanor's silver watch with a silk cloth, was Silas Kane. He looked up as Thomas entered, a slow, triumphant smile spreading across his face. "Thomas." Silas said, his voice a silken mockery of warmth. "I knew you'd come. You always did have a misplaced sense of honor." "Let them go, Silas." Thomas said, his voice dangerously level. His pistol was aimed squarely at Silas's heart. Silas chuckled, a dry, rasping sound. "All in good time. First, we have some catching up to do. You see, I've been thinking a lot about you. About Eleanor." He pocketed the watch and took a step closer to the fire, his shadow leaping up the wall behind him. "You never approved of me. You with your stern face and your silent judgment. You thought I wasn't good enough for your precious sister." A flash of lightning illuminated the room, and in that stark white light, Thomas saw the deep, festering hatred in the other man's eyes. "This isn't about your pride," Thomas growled. "Oh, but it is." Silas hissed, his voice rising. "It's always been about you. You poisoned her mind against me. You filled her head with ideas of leaving, of finding a better life. Your meddling, your judgment, drove me to it. It's your fault she fell." The words struck Thomas with the force of a physical blow. Silas was twisting the past, weaponizing Thomas's own guilt. "She fell because you were a drunken, abusive monster," Thomas bit out. "She fell because she was packing a bag to run to you." Silas screamed, his composure finally cracking. "She told me she was leaving, that you had shown her what a real man was. She spat your name in my face, so yes, I pushed her. An accident born of passion." He gestured around the room at the empire he had built. "And all this land, all this power, it's been for you, Thomas. A monument to my revenge. I wanted to destroy the one thing you hold so dear, your belief that you can save people. You couldn't save Eleanor, and you can't save them." Phase 3, the fight. The verbal confrontation exploded. Silas lunged not for a gun, but for a heavy iron poker from the fireplace. He swung it wildly, forcing Thomas to dive aside. The poker smashed into a side table, splintering it. The fight was not a clean shootout. It was a brutal, desperate struggle in the dimly lit room as the storm raged outside, shaking the very foundations of the house. Thomas fired, but the shot went wide as Silas tackled him, sending them both crashing to the floor. They rolled, grunting fists, finding flesh. Silas was wiry and surprisingly strong, fueled by years of simmering rage. He slammed Thomas's head against the floorboards, dazing him. He scrambled for the fallen poker, his eyes wild with murder. He raised it for a final killing blow. No. Florence, who had been frantically working at the ropes binding her wrists, surged forward. The ropes were still tight, but she had managed to get enough leverage to throw her entire body and the heavy chair she was tied to into Silas's path. The chair crashed into the back of his knees. He stumbled, roaring in frustration, giving Thomas the precious second he needed. Thomas kicked out his boot, connecting with Silas's jaw. Silas staggered back, dropping the poker. Thomas was on him in an instant, his hands closing around Silas's throat. They struggled, their faces inches apart, a lifetime of hatred passing between them. The fight ended not with a gunshot, but with a final desperate slam against the stone hearth. Silas went limp, his eyes rolling back, unconscious but alive. Thomas slumped against the wall, breathing heavily, the adrenaline slowly draining away, leaving only the hollow ache of Silas's words. Outside, the storm reached its crescendo, and the sound of shouting confirmed that Thornton and his men were overpowering the last of Silas's crew. The physical battle was over. The emotional one had just begun. As the storm's fury subsided, giving way to the quiet patter of rain on the roof, and the world outside the homestead came back to life, headlights cut through the pre-dawn gloom as the sheriff from Pine Creek and a hastily assembled posse, summoned by Thornton's foresight, arrived to take control. Silas and his dazed, defeated men were hauled away in irons, their short-lived empire crumbling into the mud. Among the captured was Raymond Pierce. He didn't fight or protest, simply stood with his head bowed, a pathetic, rain-soaked figure whose betrayal had bought him nothing but a place in a prison wagon. His story would end not with a bang, but with the quiet, ignominious closing of a cell door. Back inside the homestead, the immediate crisis was over, but the emotional storm still raged within Thomas. Silas's words had been a poison arrow, finding the old festering wound of his sister's death and twisting deep. "It's your fault she fell." He sat by the fire, staring into the dying embers at the weight of a guilt he thought long buried settling over him again. He had failed Eleanor. His interference, his judgment. Had it pushed Silas over the edge? Had his attempts to save her ultimately caused her death? Florence, her wrists raw, but her spirit unbroken, came and sat beside him. She didn't speak at first, simply sharing the silence, her presence a warm, steady anchor in the turbulent aftermath. Daniel had been reunited with his father, their tearful embrace a small point of light in the darkness. Now only she and Thomas remained in the room, surrounded by the wreckage of the fight. "He was lying," she said softly, her voice cutting through his spiraling thoughts. Thomas didn't look at her. "Was he? I told her to leave him. I pushed her to be strong. Maybe if I had just stayed out of it." "Then what?" Florence challenged gently. "She would have lived a longer life of misery, of beatings and fear. Is that the life you would have wished for her?" She moved closer, placing her hand on his arm. "Thomas, look at me." He slowly turned, and she saw the profound pain in his eyes. The cruelty in Silas was his own. She said, her voice filled with a certainty born of her own experience. "Men like him, like my uncle, they don't become monsters because someone provokes them. The monster is already there. They just look for excuses to let it out. He used your sister's memory as an excuse for his greed and his violence, just as my uncle used his debts as an excuse for his cruelty. Don't you dare let Silas Kane poison your love for her. Don't let him win that too." Her words were a balm, a clear, simple truth that cut through the twisted logic of his guilt. He had spent years blaming himself in the quiet, lonely hours of the night. But hearing Florence, a woman who had survived her own monster, articulate the truth with such clarity, began to lift the shadow. He looked at her, truly seeing the incredible strength and wisdom forged in her own trials. She had saved him in the fight, and now she was saving him again, pulling him back from the edge of a darkness he had carried for far too long. He leaned his head against hers, a silent surrender, and for the first time allowed someone else to share the burden of his past. Their bond forged in mutual rescue was now complete. They were equals, saving each other from the ghosts that haunted them. Weeks later, the high desert air was clean and sharp, washed free of the storm's memory. Life at the JT Ranch was slowly returning to a new kind of normal. With Silas Kane's network dismantled and his assets seized by the territory, the threat that had loomed for so long was finally gone. James Thornton, his son safely back at his side, seemed to have aged backward, the lines of worry on his face softening with each passing day. One crisp morning, he found Thomas by the corral, mending a broken fence. "I'm not getting any younger, Thomas," Thornton said, getting straight to the point. "This ranch needs a foreman who knows the land and isn't afraid of a hard day's work. More than that, it needs a man with a steady hand and a good heart. The job is yours if you want it." He gestured to the small foreman's cottage, nestled in a grove of cottonwoods. Comes with a house, a place to build a life. Thomas looked out at the rolling hills, at the cattle grazing peacefully, at the solid, honest lines of the ranch house where Florence now lived, not as a hired hand, but as a cherished member of the family. The wandering was over. The hunt was done. "I'd be honored, James," he said, accepting the offer with a firm handshake. He was finally ready to put down roots. That afternoon, he moved his few belongings into the cottage. Most of it was practical: a spare set of clothes, a good rifle, a well-used saddle. But there was one item he handled with reverence: a small, carved, wooden box. He sat on the edge of the simple bed and opened it. Inside lay a single fading photograph of his sister Eleanor. She was smiling, her eyes full of a light he had thought long extinguished. As he ran a thumb over the worn photo, he felt a slight give in the bottom of the box. A false bottom. His heart hammered in his chest. He had carried this box for years and never known. With trembling fingers, he worked a knife into the seam and pried it open. Tucked into the hidden compartment was a single folded letter, the paper yellowed and brittle with age. It was Eleanor's handwriting. "Dearest Thomas." The letter began, "If you are reading this, it means I have found the courage you always knew I had. I am leaving him. Tonight. I know you worried, and I know you felt helpless. But please never believe that. Your strength, your quiet belief that I deserved better, that is what planted this seed of hope in me. You didn't push me to do this. You simply showed me that a door existed, and I am finally ready to walk through it. I am not afraid. I am going to find a new life, a life of peace. Don't ever blame yourself for anything. You were my inspiration, my hero. All my love, Eleanor." The letter was the final absolution, a voice from the past, washing away the last vestiges of Silas's poison. The guilt that had been his constant companion for 3 years finally dissolved, leaving not an emptiness, but a clean, quiet peace. Eleanor hadn't been a victim he failed to save. She had been a hero in her own right, and he had been her inspiration. That evening, he took the letter to Florence. They sat together on the porch of the cottage, watching the sun dip below the horizon, painting the sky in strokes of fire and gold. He didn't read it to her. He simply handed it to her. She read it slowly, her expression softening with each word. When she finished, she folded it carefully and gave it back to him, her eyes shining with unshed tears. "She was so brave," Florence whispered. "Yes," Thomas said, his voice thick with emotion. "She was." He took the letter, walked to the small fireplace inside, and struck a match. He held the paper to the flame. Together, they watched Eleanor's last words turn to ash and float up the chimney, releasing her and him from the prison of the past. He turned to Florence in the warm, flickering light of their new home. In this moment of true peace, of absolute freedom, from the ghosts that had driven him for so long, he knew what he had to do. He took her hands in his. "Florence Pierce." He began, his voice steady and sure. "I've spent my life looking for something I couldn't name. It turns out it was you." He knelt before her, a simple, honest gesture that held the weight of his entire heart. "Will you build this life with me? Will you marry me?" Her answer was not a word, but a radiant smile that lit up her entire being. Her acceptance was not the end of a fairy tale, but the beginning of a real-life one. Built not on a desperate rescue, but on truth healing and a shared, unbreakable strength.